Well, I think that if Lavrov has actually disappeared, that's a definite red flag, to excuse the pun. That the end of the regime is nigh.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today, on day 1359 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're talking to Diane Francis. Now, Diane is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, well-known journalist, author, broadcaster, and editor-at-large at the National Post. Diane, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you, Philip.
This started with me reading an article that you'd put out about Ukraine's new energy war strategy. How significant a shift is this from the stalemated ground war that we're seeing? Or do you believe that the two are linked? And do you believe that targeting Russia's grid now is the most viable path to Ukrainian advantage?
Yes, I think it is. The Ukrainians are very... I would just put it this way. They're superior intellectually and strategically than the Russians. And they've proven this all along. I mean, their reinvention of warfare with the use of drones, both land and sea and air, has, somewhat mitigated the supply power disadvantage they've had against Russia from the get-go. So they've done that. But the energy war is something interesting. They're drones, they're long-distance drones, and they're using some British long distance, and they want the Tomahawks from the U.S. to attack inside Russia. They have wanted to take the war to the Russians too, and that's what they've been doing. But it's been little bits here and there. However, their long distance drones have come across a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that the Russians, after a collapse of a blackout in Moscow, revamped their entire electrical grid. And because they don't have the engineering and technical expertise of the Ukrainians or the Americans, they did a botched job. So what they noticed was that if they bombed a target 100 miles from a city or 50 miles, it was all interconnected, and it would mean that the blackout would spread without any control throughout a greater area. So what they did was they demolished a suburb of Moscow, and they found, this was in the early fall, that not only did it affect Moscow and blackouts in Moscow, but it affected the railway system throughout Russia. So that's what they're going to do. And they're going to be attacking the energy grid all over the place in Russia. The other reason why that's a good strategy, and of course, they've had their energy grid constantly attacked. But the difference is the Ukrainians have the expertise and the industrial might to replace the turbines, to repair, to fix it, to get it up and running again. The Russians don't have that. All of their industry is dedicated to making weapons that are being destroyed at the front. And they don't have the engineering and the other expertise or the manpower to get in there quickly and repair their grid. So there's a very great possibility that they can plunge a huge section of Russia, including its capital, into darkness without heat and lights through much of the winter. And that, of course, will be debilitating.
Well, one of the other things I think that I picked up from your article is that you look at Western Europe, and all of the countries are interconnected. They've got this sort of emergency extension cord that if something goes down in your country, you can call on power from another country. Russia's got lots of allies, but it doesn't seem to have that. And you suggest it doesn't have that extension cord. Is that an additional vulnerability that makes this potential tactic even more viable?
That's another Achilles heel. That's definitely another Achilles heel. And, Belarus can't supply them. Kazakhstan can't supply them. And that's another thing that's helped. Well, while they've been wrecking the grid in Ukraine, there is trace amounts of power that's coming from the European neighbors, as you say. So they have a number of Achilles heels. Russia. And, if electricity is down, you demoralize the population, and especially in the winter. So it may come that the Ukrainians will prove that electricity and winter are the greatest weapons in this war going forward.
Well, the other thing it does is, and you've hinted to it there, is it brings the war to the attention of the Russian people that Putin has spent so much effort in trying to keep it away. The other thing that seems to be bringing the war to the attention of the Russian people is the Ukrainian attack on the oil and gas infrastructure and the impact that that's having on fuel prices. And fuel availability across Russia, and again the impact that is having, the secondary impact that that's having on food prices and other goods prices across Russia. Do you think the Russian economy is in a downward spiral at the moment? And how long do you think it can sort of withstand the pressure that's on it at the moment?
Well, Trump said in October, on October 14th, that the point blank, he said the Russian economy will collapse. And I think we may be nearing that point. Not only the electrical grid would be sort of the final blow, but if they can black the whole place out in the middle of winter. But what of the other things are the signs of collapse are everywhere. Oil prices are, their oil income, I should say, are down 27% because of the bombing by Ukraine that you referred to. The cost of living is horrible. Unemployment's terrible. The body bags keep coming. And the other thing is that the National Welfare Fund, which used to have 300 billion in it, is down to 100 billion. So they're using their piggy bank. And we know that their other piggy bank, foreign earnings that they've made for years, are now in Brussels, and they're not going to get that back either. The Europeans, I think, are finally deciding to give that to Ukraine for rebuild. The other thing that I've noticed in doing my research for this show is that Russia is now in the state of anyone who's down and out, and as their economy spirals downward and their cash flow diminishes, the people they buy supplies from inside Russia and outside, including the Chinese, have just started to do price gouging. They've upped their prices. They're taking advantage. So, and part of it is that they're not sure they're ever going to get paid. So they're not going to string them out with lots of credit for months ahead. The other thing that I found was interesting is that Russia is so desperate for money that they are forward selling oil shipments to China that may never be made. So China's giving them cash for oil that may never be made. Well, what that means is that they now are racking up an enormous IOU to China, which will be cashed in. And it may be cashed in by having to give up Manchuria or something. Who knows? So they are like a person on the skids. And as they say, things go along and then they suddenly collapse. And that's, I would hope, is what we see.
Well, I was going to ask, the Chinese don't do anything for free. They will have some form of guarantee against the mortgage that they are lending the Russians. You mentioned Manchuria. Do you think that there will be territorial agreements? The Chinese are very good at negotiating these sorts of things. They've done it through most of Africa. They seem to be doing it through South, and we're heading towards Central America through businesses, and therefore the influence that brings in. Do you think they're actually physically buying parts of Russia?
Well, on that note, the Americans, Trump is very good at that too. he's got a right to the critical metals and minerals in Ukraine. So I wrote a couple of Substack newsletters in the last year and a half. Anybody can go to the archive, DianeFrancisSubstack.com. And I talk about, one is called China Waits. And where I outline that is that Manchuria, which is the westernmost, the easternmost part of Russia, includes Vladivostok, okay, and the Sakhalin Island, which has lots of oil and gas. That's old Manchuria. The Tsar stole that from China 200 years ago, and that's a sore point. And what's interesting is that currently Manchuria is divided into two halves. There's one half in the south of it that's mostly occupied or has Chinese people living in it. It's very industrialized and very prosperous. And the northern half has a bunch of Russians and all they do is drink, and it's a joke. So I can see And this is a sore point historically for China. China's not been a conquering nation, but it was chipped away at. And Manchuria is a great and important thing. If that happens, then Russia doesn't have a port on the Pacific, and then Russia really does start to fall apart.
Well, and then 200 years ago, I think the Russians started their campaign of ethnically cleansing the ethnic Chinese away from Vladivostok and the surround, and therefore China has got a long memory. It's like an elephant when it comes to memories, and therefore that it's got that in the bank. But do you think that could be an indicator that as Moscow starts?
Well, I'm just saying that the Chinese could, when this whole mess ends, turn to Russia and say, by the way, you owe us $500 billion in oil payments. We let you put it on the IOU. Give us Manchuria.
Yeah. Well, do you think that could be an indicator that if Moscow starts to lose its control and ability to keep the Russian people warm with power, with fuel, and all the rest of it, that we could start to see the elements of the Russian Federation beginning to break apart, and some of those elements deciding that maybe they would be better coming out of the Russian Federation and becoming independent states themselves, and we could see something that would resemble but be much worse than the breakup of the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah, I've written a couple of Substack newsletters about that too, and others have written about it. But the Russian Federation is just a loosely cobbled together entity of 140 ethnic groups, and they're clumped together. And they would leap at the chance to have their own nation. I would say, and I think it's easy to speculate, that if this collapse comes, it will be equivalent to what happened when Russia did another stupid, costly war in Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union fell apart. And the republics, all those republics, including Ukraine, walked away from the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation has the similar problem. The actual white Slavic Russians only live in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they are an imperial empire that controls all these other ethnic groups, and they'll go their own way, particularly in the Caucasus, in Bashkortostan, in parts of Siberia, parts of old Mongolia. We don't know what's going to happen. So I think that the template historically is there. Russia does a stupid war, loses it. The soldiers come back. They're fed up. There's a revolution, and everything changes.
Do you think this could be one of the reasons why Donald Trump is not being as hard on Vladimir Putin as the West would like him, the rest of the West would like him to be, because he sees the greater danger of the breakup of the Russian Federation and the difficulties that would place on not just the United States, but the rest of the world, and the greater instability that would bring? Or am I giving him and his administration a little bit too much credence for forward thinking and planning?
Yeah, I think that's years hence. And I'm sure that they've done, gaming, war gaming, and sort of thing. I'm sure and I'm sure there's Russians who have plans inside to take over and renovate or reform the place. Guys like Gary Kasparov are waiting in the wings. The big oligarch, I think he lives in London. He has an organization talking about helping the republics inside the Russian Federation, gain independence. Thinking is being done. The big issue is the nuclear arsenal. Who controls that? But that was taken care of even though the Soviet Union fell apart. So we're thinking way ahead of ourselves, and it takes a long time for something to actually come to a stop. But I think the signs are there. He can't win the war. The war has been too costly financially and in terms of manpower. I've got to believe he's starting to panic.
But then you look at, you said the Soviet Union nuclear arsenal was dealt with, but we had the Budapest Memorandum, and the fact that Russia did not live up to its guarantees of protecting the sovereignty of Ukraine after signing the Budapest Memorandum will mean that none of the other independent states, if they've got nuclear weapons, would give them up for a piece of paper. Do you think? But maybe I'm speculating a little too far ahead.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think the nuclear arsenal is completely guarded and controlled out of Moscow. And that seemed to be the case in the Soviet Union. There was concern about what they called loose nukes, But that didn't happen. And I think immediately, if there was an end to this mess, there would be a Western contingent of people that would be guarding the nuclear silos and so on, the weaponry that would have to be guarded if they could, or the new Russian regime would. That's a whole other issue. We're not there yet. Poor Ukraine is still getting pulverized by this monster, and so, as far as I'm concerned, the collapse can't happen too soon. On the other hand, it does, as we're talking, generate a whole new subset of problems.
Well, in the last sort of 24, 36 hours, the Kremlin news agency TASS, citing Alexei Ivanov, who's the Russian chargé d'affaires in Turkey, has said that Russia is ready to continue direct negotiations with the Ukrainian side. Do you think this could be an indication that Putin recognizes that his position is becoming increasingly difficult and is now wanting to reach out and throw this olive branch out? Or is he just playing to Donald Trump to try and stop Donald Trump from coming down harder on Putin and more favorably for Zelensky and for Ukraine?
I think he's buying time again. Let's talk, then it'll take weeks, and then they'll talk, and then that'll take more weeks. And then he'll just walk away having given away nothing again. I don't think that Trump is going to fall for that again. And you said, why isn't Trump tougher? Let's not forget, we're dealing with, I think, an irrational man, Putin, and he has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. And so whatever is done has to be done with that eventuality or that possibility in mind. So that's his only advantage at this point, is that he could blow up Europe, maybe the world.
Other indicators that seem to be coming out of Moscow that all things may not be right is, Foreign Minister Lavrov seems to have gone very silent after he managed to derail the potential meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Budapest. Now, in the last 24 hours, I've seen some of his posts coming back up on social media, whether it's actually him or whether it's pre-recorded or whether it's something else. What do you think's going on there?
Well, I think that if Lavrov has actually disappeared, that's a definite red flag, to excuse the pun, that the end of the regime is nigh. Yes, they're bosom buddies. It would appear, according to some of the things I read, that Putin is blaming Lavrov for not making a deal. Well, of course, when in actual fact, it's Putin who's not making the deal and Lavrov. Now, could be other reasons for Lavrov's disappearance. He may have fallen out of a window, or he may have fled. I mean, think about it. If you're in with Putin and you know that it's hopeless and he is getting more and more crazy, I don't think you go down with the ship. I think you find a safe harbor. I don't know. And he may pop up again. He may just have a cold. I don't know.
Yeah, there may be a medical problem with that, like when he had a few months back on, I can't remember where it was he was visiting. It was somewhere in Southeast Asia, and he disappeared for a few days because the rumors said he had had a heart attack of some description.
I think it's a tough job he has.
Yeah, well, yes, but he's such a wily old character, and he's probably this analogy is wrong, but as powerful as Putin, but in a different way. Putin is definitely the puppet master, but Lavrov is not quite the puppet. He seems to have a degree of control over the puppet master, if anything.
Yes, and he's like all the other ones around Putin. It's a mafia. He's got money salted away all over the world. His kids are millionaires many times over, and he will emerge from the wreckage. If he emerges from the wreckage, pretty much okay himself personally. Is he a successor? Is he the guy that's going to get rid of Julius Caesar? I don't think so. I think he's a nasty piece of work, and he's very devoted to Putin. But if he's disappeared, that would be significant.
That's something for us to watch. Now, coming elsewhere, the other bit of talk that there's been in the recent weeks in the press is around U.S. supply of Tomahawk cruise missiles, and you mentioned it earlier. Touching on Trump's wobbles over Tomahawks, do you think with the political climate in the US so uncertain as we're starting the run up to the midterms and everything else, how dependent is the long range energy strategy and steady supply of Western weapons for Ukraine that you may not necessarily be guaranteed because Trump seems to flip one way or the other way? Or do you think Ukraine has now built up a degree of robustness where no matter what direction the US goes, it's always got a solution?
Well, remember, Trump now has gone from complaining about the cost of supporting Ukraine to bragging about how much money they're making selling the weapons to the Europeans and the Brits who are paying for it. So I don't think he cares about any halt in weapons flows from the U.S. to Ukraine. In fact, quite the opposite. America's profiting now, not losing. I think the Tomahawk thing, however, is a whole other ballgame because the Tomahawk is a long range weapon and very powerful. And if aimed at, destroying vast portions of oil facilities and power gen in Russia, would probably incite Putin to the point where he might go nuclear. You remember, we're dealing with a nuclear power here. And so you can go so far and then you can't. And even if it's given to someone else in their hands, you do retain some responsibility for what goes on. Not only that, but the Tomahawks have the ability, apparently, to just destroy all of the oil industry in Russia. And most of that oil industry was built and designed by American oil companies who want to go back and run it when the war is over if Putin's gone. So I'm not saying that's a reason for not doing it. And I think the on again, off again is a strategy. It's rattling. It imbalances the conversation and probably kind of rattles Putin. Are they going to do it or not?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that the oil infrastructure built by US companies and all the rest of it. I remember back in the Balkans, whenever NATO was looking at air attacks against Serbia and the telecoms infrastructure that was in Serbia, which was all owned by and put in by Italian telecoms companies, of which they were partially owned by the Italian government. So the aircraft were being launched from Italy, and therefore they were launching attacks against something that the government part owned. And that caused a degree of political consternation. And therefore I can see that same sort of political consternation putting pressure on Donald Trump. Do you think there is a real dilemma between the business side of warfare and the political side of warfare, and Donald Trump's assertions that he's just out to seek peace to stop the killing?
No, I don't think there's any dilemma, but I think business considerations are taken into, into consideration when you're doing that. That was kind of a cynical remark about, the American companies, Exxon and so on, want to go back in and grab it. But, he confiscated everything American inside Russia. And of course, that would have to be dealt with when and if this thing ever ends. And I'm not saying that he doesn't want to destroy the former Exxon refinery in Siberia, but it's I think it's the nuclear thing that's worrisome, because then it would be, my understanding is that any weapons arms trading that goes on by Germany, Britain, or the U.S., the sovereign nation where the arms were made has to approve who that weaponry is sold to, so that it's not sold to the enemies of the state or create a problem like this. So there is always a brake on weapons sales.
Well, coming to the weapon sales and difficulties there are around that, the other thing that has come out in the last few days is more on the anti-corruption side of things inside Ukraine itself. A new investigation by Ukraine's Anti-Corruption Bureau, the NABU, has already led to the suspension of the Justice Minister, German Gulashenko, who was a former energy minister. How devastating do you think this news is to Ukraine's credibility with its Western partners, who are continuously being asked to fund the war, to help with energy repairs? Or do you think it's a demonstration that if it has been identified that Ukraine is dealing with the endemic corruption that's been there from its old Soviet days?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I think that, Ukraine was run indirectly by Russia before the war, and it was run like Russia. The rule of law was a joke, and it was very corrupt. And Zelensky has done a good job of cleaning it up. There was an investigation in June that he ended, and then there was an outcry and street protests, and he reinstated it. And I think that, plus other ongoing investigations, has led to what we now have found out, and that is there was some kickback schemes involving possibly some members of his cabinet, at least one, we think, and maybe more. And I think he said they will pay the price. There will be convictions. It doesn't touch him. I don't think, and I don't think it ever will. But, we'll have to see. And he's unleashed the dogs on it. And there will be people that he's got to fire people. He's got to do all of that. But it's hardly surprising. And, this is part of what Ukraine's war is about. It's internal as well as external.
But Ukraine's such a young democracy. Do you think that they have made significant progress if you compare it to other democracies in dealing with corruption and the accusations around it as they need to prepare for potential EU membership?
I think they are, but they've got a war to prosecute first before they prosecute bad guys. And I think that their whole push is to get into the European Union. And once they do that, they will clean up, the whole thing will be cleaned up very quickly, as it was in Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland when they joined, because the European institutions won't tolerate it. The judiciary will be clean as a whistle. All kinds of processes will be, carefully sculpted so that this doesn't happen. Any more than, crime normally happens here and there. So, the whole idea is to Europeanize the country so that you get rid of the slime and the crime and in one fell swoop. And this is part of the issue and the problem. However, apart from all of that, there is no question as to the personal, psychological, and economic sacrifices that the Ukrainian people and their government have made, to keep Russia away from the rest of from taking over their country and the rest of Europe.
Well, I hope Laura, the producer, turned around and said that you should bring your crystal ball with you, because the next question relates to that. What do you think is going to happen through 2026?
I think there's a very good chance, I wouldn't put a percentage on it, that Russia goes bust and that there is a slowdown in the war or maybe an end to it. It would be sloppy. It would be a mess. And it may contain some very ugly surprises because, we know what Hitler wanted to do in the dying days of his regime. He wanted to blow up Paris and everything else. So we're in dangerous territory here. On one hand, I hope their economy collapses because that will finish Putin and therefore the war. On the other hand, I hope that there are people inside Russia who know how to handle this if that happens.
Well, I heard a very interesting statistic the other day. We're about 6 weeks off the same length of time that the Soviet Union fought against the Germans during the Second World War and pushed the Nazis back from the gates of Moscow to right back to Berlin. In the same length of time in Ukraine, they've advanced about 10 to 20 kilometers. And that puts the whole thing into perspective. But Diane, it's been a real pleasure talking to you once again on Times Radio Frontline.
Thank you, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.